Hello everyone, so today I'm going to be talking about obedience and this is Milgram's research. As always, I'm following along with the AQA Psychology textbook with the girl with the green hair on, and in the bottom right hand corner I have got a picture of the setup of the experiment that Milgram carried out. As always, I've got my normal slide of things you need to know and be able to recognise. So these are the few things that I point out here. So what is obedience? What is the difference between conformity and obedience? This is where students always get confused because they don't have a clear definition of those two different things. The fact that Milgram relates to obedience, not conformity, that is also where students forget. And finally, that Milgram conducted his research in 1963. So this is before Zimbardo, but after Ash. So, what is obedience? Obedience is when an individual follows a direct order. The person issuing the order is usually a figure of authority who has the power to punish when obedient behaviour is not forthcoming. So the picture at the bottom shows a teacher ordering students to line up. Now, if one of those students decided not to do that, that teacher has the authority to tell the child off. Here's my conformity versus obedience table. This has been asked before. What is the difference between obedience and conformity? And students weren't sure at all, really, because they didn't know how to compare them. So breaking it down to a table like this does help. So obedience occurs within a hierarchy, and when we look at conformity, it regulates behaviour among those of equal status. For obedience, behaviour is different to that of the authority figure, whereas for conformity, behaviour adopted is similar to that of peers. For obedience, the prescription for an action is explicit. For conformity, there is this requirement for going along with the group, and that is often implicit. And finally, obedience is embraced as an explanation for someone's behaviour, whereas for conformity, participants deny it as an explanation of their behaviour. So this is the procedure. So I've got the same picture as what we had on the first slide in the top right hand corner to help you visualise this. So what Milgram did was he recruited 40 male participants through a newspaper ad or poster flyers, and the advertisement said that the study was trying to recruit individuals to take part in memory, in a study that was going to look at memory. And these participants were aged between 20 and 50 years. They were offered $4.50 to take part, and that was paid at the start of the study. And in those sort of times in the 1960s, that was seen as quite a lot of money. However, when the participant arrived to take part, the role of them always being a teacher was rigged, so they were always that particular sort of character in this scenario. So the student was always a confederate, so that's somebody acting, and the experimenter was also an actor. So Mr. Wallace was always that student, that learner, while the true participant was always the teacher. And as you can see, there's a line between the teacher and the student, and that's because they're in separate rooms, and that wire is in theory electric, and that's connected to that learner. Participants were told, though, that they could leave the study at any time. So the teacher was required to give this increasingly severe electric shock each time the student got an answer wrong. And what the student was doing was matching word pairs together. But what happened with the student is, because that's an actor, they were ensuring that they made the wrong mistake on the same time for every new participant. So it was always the exact same for every single participant that took part. The shocks were demonstrated before the study took place, and from then on they weren't real. So they were shown to be real, and then from after that, once they were shown, they were no longer real. And the shocks started at 15 and they went up to 450, each going up by 15 volts each time. And at 300 volts, the learner pounded on the wall, and they did this again at 315 volts. But after 315, there was no further response. An absence of response should be treated as a wrong answer. Now, when the participant was unsure what to do, they would turn to the experimenter, and that is what the experimenter would say. And if they were still not sure, the 4 prods were then used. So prod 1 was please continue or please go on. Prod 2, the experiment requires that you continue. Prod 3, it is absolutely essential that you continue. And prod 4, you have no other choice. You must go on. Now, the way I remember these, because this would form your AO1 description in an essay style question, I remember these as they get worse as they go on. So the higher the number, the worse they sound. So it's, oh, please continue. Then it's that the experiment requires you to do that, and then it's absolutely essential, and then you don't have a choice. So try and remember it like that. It gets more harsher the further on in numbers you are. So the findings were that no one stopped below 300 volts and only 12.5% stopped at 300 volts. So that was 5 participants, while 65% continued to the highest level of 450 volts. Now, during the study, lots of qualitative data was collected. So that's the written stuff. And what we find is that a lot of the participants were sweating, they were trembling, biting their lips and digging their fingernails into their hands. And we find also that 3 of the participants had full-blown uncontrollable seizures. And now, prior to the study, Milgram had asked psychology students about what they thought the participants' behaviour would look like when they take part in the study. And their prediction was that no more than 3% would go to the full 450 volts. But actually we find that 65% do so. So the results in themselves were quite surprising to even psychology students. And now all the participants were debriefed afterwards, and 84% of them said that they were happy to have taken part in the study. Okay, so now we have the evaluation, which will form part of your AO3. So our first criticism is that there is low internal validity. Now, what we mean by internal validity is, did the participants believe it was real, what they were doing, or did they guess that it was an artificial situation, the shocks weren't real? Now, All and Holland suggests that participants behaved like they did, so showing signs of sweating and trembling. They did that because they just didn't believe in the setup of the situation. They pressed all of the volts, so going up in 15s, they went all the way up to 450 because, well, I know the shocks aren't real anyway. So what they're saying is that participants realised these shocks weren't real, so therefore the study has low internal validity. They're saying that the participants guessed and they didn't think they were real. Perry then listens to the recordings of the participants during the study and reports that they even doubted the shocks being real. So it would suggest that there is this low internal validity. But then Sheridan and King, this is their own study, they found that 54% of males and 100% of females delivered what they thought was a fatal shock to a dog. So they were shown proper shocks, real shocks, and it was a real shock then that was given to a dog, but they still acted in the same way. So it suggests that the effects of Milgram were real, as people behave the same way when shocks are real. A strength of Milgram is that there is good external validity. So despite the study being conducted in a lab, so it can be unrealistic of everyday life, the relationship between the authority figure, which is an experimenter, and the participant does reflect real life, as the idea that you have an experimenter and a student or a participant, it's a hierarchy structure that exists in everyday society. And this has actually been supported by other research. So you can bring in Hofflin et al. Here and think of Hofflin as nurses. So what they found was that 21 out of 22 nurses obeyed doctors who told them to give patients an unknown drug. So they hadn't heard of this drug before, but they still went on and did it. 21 did so. And so therefore it suggests that Milgram's lab study can be generalised to other situations, as even when nurses didn't know what this drug was, they still went on and delivered it to their patients. So it is valuable about how obedience operates in real life. Furthermore, we have supporting replication. So this is another strength. I'm going to pronounce this wrong, but Le Jeu de la Mort, the Game of Death, was a replication of Milgram's study. It was shown on French television, and what participants were doing was practically the same thing as what Milgram's participants were doing, but they thought they were pilots in a new game show. So they were paid, just like Milgram's participants, to give fake electric shocks to other participants, but these participants are Confederates, they're actors, and it's in front of a studio audience. So what happens is 80% of participants give 460-volt shocks to an apparently unconscious man. And their behaviour was almost identical to that of Milgram. So that nail biting and nervous laughter, that anxiety that was shown in Milgram's participants is practically the same in this, even though 80% deliver the highest shock of 460 volts. So this actually does support Milgram's results, and it shows that Milgram's results aren't just a fluke or a one-off, because this replication suggests the same thing as what Milgram's research does. Criticism is that there is an alternative explanation, this idea of social identity theory, and what that argues is that you have to identify with something in order for obedience. So you need to identify with the study in some way. So what was happening in Milgram's study, why there was such high levels of obedience, was because of this social identity theory at work. So participants were identifying with the science of the study, but when obedience falls, it's because participants identify with something else, so another group. They're no longer identifying with the science. And Haslam and Reicher, what they do is they analyse the behaviour of the participants, and they find that the first three prods are not demanding obedience, but the fourth one does. When it says it is absolutely essential that you continue, you have no other choice, that does not demand obedience anymore. It doesn't demand for help with science. It opens it up. And so that last prod isn't doing that, and therefore the participants identify more with the learner. So the participants all resisted when the fourth prod was used. This contradicts Milgram because he said his findings were due to participants unquestionably accepting the authority of the experimenter. And finally, another limitation is ethical issues. There was no follow-up on the participants, and they were exposed to psychological and physical harm. They were strongly encouraged to carry on, even though they had asked about what they should do. The experimenter was still saying carry on using the prods. And participants thought they were randomly allocated to their roles, so they thought they had an equal chance of either being the learner or the teacher, but they didn't. They were always going to be the teacher. And participants were told that the shocks were real when they weren't, so therefore we have deception. Okay, so I've had a look on the AQA past papers site, and there doesn't really seem to be much on Milgram. I couldn't find a long question that's been asked about him. So I've used a textbook question, and this one here says describe and evaluate Milgram's research into obedience. So it'll be 12 marks at AS or 16 marks at A level. You can get a 12 marker in an A level paper, and I've put the breakdown at the bottom there. So for AS, you're looking at an equal split with your AO1 and AO3 marks. Remember, AO1 is your description, AO3 is your evaluation. 12 marks at A level changes because it wants more AO3, it reckons that skill should be more developed by then, and 16 marks, it does a 6 marks AO1, 10 marks AO3. Now, if this question said discuss Milgram's research into obedience, it would still be the same thing. Discuss means describe and evaluate. And this question would trick, I think, a lot of students in the sense that it's where I've highlighted in red, it says Milgram's research. So it wants you to describe and evaluate Milgram's research, which means your evaluation must be towards Milgram's research. You can't go on and start talking about somebody else's study and say, oh, that doesn't support because of this. It has to relate to Milgram's research. You'd have to make sure, if you are using others' research, that it relates to Milgram's research. But what it really wants is you to critique and really so use strengths and limitations of Milgram's research. And if you didn't focus on that, you'd be struggling to get marks. So that's a bit of a pointer for you there. Really make sure you're reading the question carefully. Okay, thank you for listening and best of luck with all your revision.